They say your wedding day is supposed to be perfect. Mine was, until the moment my in-laws laughed at my father and unknowingly triggered a reckoning that would silence an entire room of 300 guests. I'm Janis Minton, Army captain, war veteran, daughter, and what happened at my reception wasn't just drama. It was a masterclass in dignity that left my new in-laws speechless, ashamed, and forever changed. But before I take you there, before I show you what my father did that made hardened soldiers rise to their feet and brought tears to eyes that hadn't cried in years, I need you to understand something critical. If you're new to Valor Voice, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell right now. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a wedding tale with a twist. It's a lesson about judgment, identity, and the devastating power of assumptions. And I promise you, you've never heard a story quite like this one. Trust me when I say, you'll want to stay until the very end. Because what my father revealed in those final moments, even I didn't see coming. I need to take you back. Back before the white dress, before the decorations, before the moment everything shattered and rebuilt itself in the span of 10 unforgettable minutes. I grew up with my father, Daniel Minton, in a small house with creaking floors and windows that rattled when storms rolled through. We didn't have much. But what we had was solid, real, unshakable. My father was a man of quiet dignity. Not loud. Not boastful. Not the type to dominate a room with his presence. He was steady, like a river that flows so consistently you forget it has the power to carve through mountains. He didn't wear his service on his sleeve. Literally. You'd never catch him in those veteran baseball caps or jackets covered in patches and unit insignias. To him, that felt like peacocking. Service, he always told me, was something you did in the shadows, not something you paraded in the light. Daniel Minton served in the Army long before I was born, long before I even understood what sacrifice meant. He deployed to places whose names I couldn't pronounce as a child, places where the sun baked the earth and danger lurked in every shadow. But he never talked about it. Never told war stories at barbecues. Never used his service to win arguments or gain sympathy. To him, being a veteran wasn't an identity, it was a responsibility. A silent contract between him and a country that might never fully understand what he'd given. That humility? That quiet strength? It shaped me. When I joined the military at 22, it wasn't rebellion or escape. It was inheritance. A legacy of service, courage, and silent sacrifice that ran through my veins like a second bloodstream. I wanted to be like him, not loud, not seeking glory, just present. Steady. Ready. And yet, as my wedding day approached, I found myself worrying. Not about my father's worthiness, I knew his value better than anyone. No, I worried about how others would see him. Especially people like my future in-laws, who measured worth in bank accounts, job titles, and social media followers. People who barely knew the meaning of sacrifice beyond reposting a patriotic meme on the 4th of July. When my fiancé, Marcus, and I announced our engagement, his family's reaction was complicated. They smiled. They congratulated us. But there was something behind their eyes, a calculation, a quiet assessment. They were wealthy, well-connected, the kind of family that had people for everything. Estate planners. Image consultants. A lawyer on retainer just in case. My family? We had each other. That was it. That was enough. The day of the wedding arrived like a dream wrapped in anxiety. The venue was spectacular, a grand banquet hall with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a manicured garden. Everything gleamed. Everything was perfect. On the outside. My father walked into that hall with his usual posture, eyes forward, shoulders squared, chin level. He wore a simple dark suit, pressed and clean, with a single pin on his lapel. Nothing flashy. Nothing demanding attention. But somehow, he commanded it anyway. I saw people glance his way as he moved through the crowd. Some looked curious. Some respectful. A few older guests nodded with knowing smiles, the kind of recognition that passes between people who've walked similar paths. All except my in-laws. From the moment Marcus's parents, Richard and Constance, arrived, their eyes told a different story. Not admiration. Not respect. Just judgment. Cold, calculating judgment. They whispered to each other, heads close together like conspirators. They snickered behind manicured hands. And worst of all, they mocked him. My father. The man who raised me alone after my mother passed. The man who taught me what honor actually meant. Not loudly. Not crudely. They were too sophisticated for that. But just loud enough that I could hear. Just pointed enough that others started to notice. He looks like he wandered in from a museum exhibit, Constance murmured to her sister. Isn't he a little too old to be walking around without assistance? Richard added, not even trying to hide his smirk. Maybe someone should offer him a seat, or a walker. My hands clenched. My military training had taught me discipline, restraint, situational awareness, how to stay calm when bullets flew and chaos erupted. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for hearing my father mocked on what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I wanted to say something. Wanted to march over there and set them straight. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the venue, the occasion, the eyes of 300 guests. Or maybe it was the look on my father's face, calm, almost amused, like he knew something I didn't. That look should have been my first clue. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows. The music swelled at all the right moments. I walked down that aisle in my white dress, arm linked with my father's, and for a few precious minutes, everything felt sacred. But even then, I felt the whispers. Saw the sideways glances aimed at my father. Heard the barely concealed comments about his age, his appearance, his simple demeanor. Marcus's family sat in the front row, smiling for the cameras but exchanging looks that said everything their words didn't. The ceremony ended. We were married. The crowd applauded. And then came the reception, where everything would either hold together or completely fall apart. Spoiler, it fell apart. Spectacularly. The reception hall buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. The wedding party laughed and posed for photos. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Everything was going according to plan. Until the welcome toast. Traditionally, the groom's father gives the first toast. Richard stood, champagne flute in hand, microphone in the other. He smiled that practiced smile of his, all teeth, no warmth. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice smooth and practiced, what a beautiful day to celebrate the union of my son Marcus and his lovely bride, Janis. Applause. Smiles. Everything seemed fine. Then he continued. I'd like to thank all our guests for being here today. Family, friends, colleagues. He paused, his eyes scanning the room before landing on my father. And of course, some very unique individuals who add character to any occasion. A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. Take, for instance, the gentleman seated near the back there, Richard gestured vaguely toward my father. I'm told he once served in the military, quite a long time ago, I imagine. The kind of guy who could probably fall asleep during a firefight and still manage to snooze right through it. He laughed at his own joke. A few people joined in awkward, forced laughter that died quickly. But the damage was done. My heart plummeted into my stomach. My face burned. Around the room, I saw guests exchange uncomfortable glances. Some shifted in their seats. Others suddenly found their plates very interesting. My father? He looked down at his shoes, jaw tight, eyes sharp as flint. Something in him shifted. I saw it, a subtle change in posture, a flicker of something dangerous behind his calm exterior. In that moment, I didn't understand what was happening. But I should have. Because my father wasn't just a veteran. He was a soldier. And soldiers don't react, they respond. Strategically. Decisively. With devastating precision. The rest of the toasts blurred together. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, laughed when laughter was expected, but inside I was burning. Fury mixed with humiliation mixed with something else, a strange anticipation, like standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark, knowing something was about to give way but not knowing when or how. My father remained seated through the meal, polite and quiet. He chatted with the guests at his table, other relatives and family friends who seemed genuinely interested in his conversation. But I noticed something. Every few minutes, his eyes would scan the room. Not nervously. Purposefully. Like he was taking inventory. Making calculations. Meanwhile, my in-laws continued their commentary. They say he was in the army once, Constance whispered loudly to a cousin. Really? I can barely imagine him carrying a backpack, let alone a weapon. Probably spent his whole service filing paperwork, Richard added with a dismissive wave. You know how these things are exaggerated. Everyone's a hero in their own story. More laughter. More knowing nods. I wanted to scream. To flip the table. To stand up and defend the man who defended so many others. But then something happened that changed everything. An older woman, someone I didn't recognize, perhaps a distant relative of Marcus's family, approached me during a lull between courses. She had silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and eyes that held the weight of decades. Your father, she said, her voice low and serious, is a remarkable man. Thank you, I replied automatically, still reeling from the earlier humiliation. No, dear, you don't understand. She leaned closer, her expression intense. Your father isn't just any veteran. He's not someone you mock. Ever. My breath caught. What do you mean? She glanced toward my father, then back to me. He was part of Operation Silent Shield. One of the original storm operatives deployed overseas. Do you understand what that means? I didn't. Not fully. But the way she said it, with reverence, with awe, made my skin prickle. He saved dozens of lives. Maybe more. The things he did. She shook her head. Most people will never know. Can never know. But those of us who do, we remember. She touched my hand gently. He's not just respected, dear. He's legendary. And anyone mocking him right now is making a catastrophic mistake. She walked away, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, mind racing. I looked across the room at my father. He caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing smile. The same smile he'd given me when I was 7 and trying to ride my bike without training wheels, encouraging, patient, and somehow already certain of the outcome. That's when I knew something was about to happen. Something big. It started with a simple gesture. My father stood. Not dramatically. Not with fanfare. He simply rose from his seat and began walking toward the small stage where the DJ booth stood. Conversations continued. People didn't notice at first. But I did. and so did that older woman, who watched with a slight smile playing at her lips. My father spoke briefly to the DJ, who immediately handed over the microphone. The music faded. Gradually, conversations died down. 300 faces turned toward the stage where my father now stood, calm, composed, with that same quiet dignity he'd always carried. "Janis," he said, his voice steady and commanding without being loud, "there's something I want to say." The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that marble floor. My father looked at me first, eyes warm, almost teasing, filled with pride. Then he looked at every face in that room, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before finally settling on Richard and Constance. "This day is meant to celebrate love," he began. "Not ego. Not jest. Not the belittling of what another person has lived through." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I've served with men and women who knew what respect truly costs," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "It isn't marked by titles or bank accounts. It isn't earned through wealth or social position. It isn't shown through laughter at someone's age or experience." I saw my in-laws stiffen. Richard's champagne flute froze halfway to his lips. Constance's carefully maintained expression cracked just slightly. "You may think you know me," my father said, his eyes still locked on them, "but you don't." Gasps rippled through the crowd. People leaned forward in their seats. And then he dropped the truth that would change everything. "I wasn't just a soldier who filed paperwork or fell asleep during operations," my father said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I was part of Operation Silent Shield, a classified unit that operated in some of the most dangerous territories our country has ever sent personnel into." The room erupted in whispers. Heads turned. People pulled out phones, some clearly searching for information, others frozen in shock. "For 3 years," he continued, "my team and I protected supply routes, extracted civilians from war zones, and dismantled threats that most Americans will never know existed. We operated in the shadows because that's where the real work happens. Not for glory. Not for recognition. But because it needed to be done." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I earned commendations, not for medals on this jacket," he gestured to his chest where that single pin rested, "but for the lives we saved together. 63 civilians extracted from hostile territory. For supply convoys protected through ambush zones. 12 enemy positions neutralized before they could harm innocent people." The silence was deafening now. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. "But here's what I want you to understand," my father said, his voice softening slightly. "Those numbers? They don't define me. The medals locked in a drawer at home? They don't make me special. What makes any of us worth respecting is the choice we make, to serve something bigger than ourselves. To sacrifice comfort for duty. To stand in the gap when others can't or won't." He looked directly at Richard and Constance. "If you've come here to mock service, sacrifice, or honor, ask yourselves first, what have you given up for others? When have you put someone else's life above your own comfort? When have you stood in the darkness so others could stay in the light?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. My father didn't attack. He didn't shame. He simply held up a mirror, and the reflection was devastating. Then, he did something even more powerful. "There are others in this room," he said, "who have also served. Who have also sacrificed. Who know what I'm talking about without needing explanation." He paused, scanning the crowd. "If you've worn the uniform, any branch, any era, any capacity, would you please stand?" For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, slowly, people began to rise. An older man near the bar, probably in his 70s, stood with difficulty but with unmistakable pride. A woman in her 50s at a corner table rose, her eyes glistening. 3 younger guests near the back, probably Marines based on their bearing, stood as one unit. More followed. And more. Young and old. Men and women. Some in suits, some in dresses. Some with visible scars, others with invisible ones. Within 30 seconds, at least 40 people were standing. 40 souls who had answered the call. 40 lives that had chosen service over self. The room transformed. What had been a wedding reception became something else entirely, a memorial, a tribute, a moment of collective recognition. And my in-laws? They sat frozen, faces pale, expressions shifting from confusion to realization to something that looked like horror. My father didn't gloat. Didn't point fingers. He simply nodded to each standing veteran, acknowledging them with the respect they deserved. "Thank you," he said simply. "You may be seated." They sat, and the room remained silent, waiting. "I didn't share this to embarrass anyone," my father continued, his voice gentle now. "I shared it because we live in a world that often mistakes silence for weakness. That confuses humility with insignificance. That assumes if someone isn't shouting about their accomplishments, they must not have any." He looked at me, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time in years. My daughter followed in my footsteps. She serves with the same quiet dignity, the same commitment to something greater than herself. And watching her today, marrying a good man, starting a new chapter, this is what we served for. This moment. This joy. This future. He turned back to the crowd. "So let this be a lesson, not just for today, but for every day. Never assume you know someone's story. Never mock what you don't understand. Never confuse quiet strength with weakness." He handed the microphone back to the DJ and walked off the stage. No fanfare. No applause, not at first. Just stunned silence. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, applauding not just my father, but everything he represented. Everything he taught them in those 10 minutes. I met him halfway across the floor and wrapped my arms around him, tears streaming down my face. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I whispered. "Because it wasn't about me," he whispered back. "It was never about me." The rest of the evening was different. Transformed. People approached my father, not with pity or awkward curiosity, but with genuine respect. Veterans shared stories. Younger guests asked questions. Even people who'd never served seemed to see him differently, truly see him for the first time. And my in-laws? Richard approached my father about an hour later. I watched from across the room, tense and ready to intervene. But Richard didn't make excuses. He extended his hand, and when my father took it, Richard said something that made my father nod. Later, my father told me Richard had simply said, "I was wrong. I'm sorry. And thank you." It wasn't enough. Not for the humiliation. Not for the mocking. But it was something. A crack in the armor. A beginning. Constance followed shortly after, her apology more elaborate but equally sincere. She actually cried, which I'd never seen before. "I had no idea," she kept saying. "I had no idea." "Most people don't," my father replied gently. "That's the point." That night, long after the music faded and the guests departed, after the venue was empty and the decorations were being packed away, I sat with my father in the parking lot under a blanket of stars. "You knew they would mock you," I said. "It wasn't a question." He smiled. "I suspected." And you planned all of that? Not planned, he corrected. Prepared. There's a difference. I didn't want to make a scene. But I was ready to teach a lesson if one was needed. I shook my head, still processing everything. You're amazing, you know that? No, he said, putting his arm around my shoulders. I'm just a man who learned something important a long time ago. Respect isn't demanded. It's demonstrated. And the people who truly deserve it rarely ask for it. He looked at me with those same steady eyes that had guided me through childhood, through my military career, through every challenge I'd faced. You did good today, Janis, he said. No, I told him, my voice thick with emotion. We did good. Because healing doesn't start with blame or revenge. It starts with truth. And sometimes truth, spoken by someone who has lived it, not just repeated it, is the greatest gift you can give. My wedding day didn't go as planned. It went better. Because 300 people learned something that day. About judgment. About assumptions. About the quiet warriors who walk among us, asking for nothing, deserving everything. If this story moved you, hit like, share, and subscribe to Valor Voice. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated only to prove everyone wrong? Have you witnessed quiet strength that changed a room? Let's talk, because your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard. And remember this, respect isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need to prove itself. Real respect is steadfast. Quiet. Unshakable. Just like my father. Just like every person who serves something greater than themselves. I'm Janis Minton, Army Captain, War Veteran, daughter, storyteller, and this is Valor Voice. Where real stories matter. Where truth finds its strength. And where you find the courage to stand, no matter who doubts you. Because in the end, the people who matter will always see you. Always.